Redistricting is the process by which we draw the boundaries for congressional and state legislative districts. This generally is something that takes place once every 10 years, but it also can be an ongoing process, either because of litigation or for other reasons. The idea of having districts, I think, really comes from our history that, we were colonies who in many ways modeled our government off of England. And, what, you saw there was they had boroughs and, people represented, those areas. It was a way of dividing up easily recognizable communities and making sure that they had representation, not always based on their population size. And so this is a process that has always been very political and very contentious, and that carried over in American history. But the idea was that that was just a common way of dividing up a legislature. But it's actually not the only way we've done that throughout our history. In some states, they have had what were known as multi-member districts, and sometimes those multi-member districts were quite large. But multi-member districts for Congress were outlawed by Congress in the mid 20th century over concerns that the practice was being used to dilute the influence of racial minorities. And so at the moment, congressional districts can only have one representative per district. But if that law, should be changed, it actually is possible that, some states, depending on their size, might choose to have just multiple at-large members for the entire state. And of course, we have a handful of very small population states who only send one member to Congress, and so they represent their entire state. Who draws the lines varies quite a bit by state. In some states, the state legislature itself draws the lines. And so you'll have usually a committee of the legislature who will draw some maps, and those maps go before the whole legislature, and they try to get agreement on it that way. Another model is having, what's thought of as a redistricting commission. Often these are made up of other officials. Sometimes they're state legislators, sometimes the governor of a state or the secretary of state is involved. And it's sort of a smaller group of usually elected officials, usually partisan officials, whose job it is to try to draw the maps. And sometimes those maps go back to the legislature, sometimes they don't. In other states, they have a model where the commissions are thought of as truly independent from the political process. And so in places like California and Arizona, they have citizen redistricting commissions where members of the general public get to participate in and run that process. And it's really just up to those commissions. It doesn't go back to the legislature. There isn't an opportunity for a governor to veto. And so, there's quite a bit of variation across the country in how lines are drawn. States use a variety of criteria, and then there are a few criteria that either has been set essentially by Supreme Court through some of its rulings, and then some criteria which have been set by Congress. And so the most common criteria that we see is something called contiguity. That means the entirety of a district needs to be connected. It can't have some island, part of the district where there is no connection to the rest of that territory. They have compactness, which is a little bit less a strict criteria. That's where you really try to avoid having some of these elongated and other misshapen districts. So it's a little harder to define exactly what makes a compact district. And then, there are some other things. Like I said, there's obviously restrictions around avoiding racial gerrymandering. In some states, they have to avoid partisan gerrymandering. The other criteria that's out there, of course, came from a Supreme Court decision, which has to do with having equal numbers of citizens in each district for Congress. And so that one really means that within a state and generally across the country, there are almost, exactly equal numbers of citizens to members of Congress or members of the House for that district.